Good morning, everyone. I've spoken to a number of you before, and for those of you who I have, it's great to speak to you again. Is the screen now up and sharing?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, thank you so much. Just wanted to get some confirmation there. So, as David said, what we're going to speak about now is intelligence-driven prosecution and the use of crime strategies units to help enable that. The purpose of the next half hour or so, which is quicker than some of the ways we do this presentation, is to lay out the philosophy of intelligence-driven prosecution. And I do want to stress that the most important concept is that this is a philosophy. This is a change in mindset. I think if you view it that way, rather than just what are the resources that I need in order to replicate things that I'm hearing about today, then an office of any size can get value out of this conversation, this philosophy, and this mindset. Because taken together, the shift to an intelligence-driven model, the formation of a CSU to implement it, and working through the technology and information management tasks and technology can seem daunting. But moving to an intelligence-driven model doesn't have to be. The philosophical change is the big step, and it does not need to be a huge resource drain. So what do we mean by intelligence-driven prosecution? This is, I promise, the only time I will read a slide, but the goal is to focus the collective resources of a prosecutor's office on strategic goals of reducing crime, particularly violent crime, while limiting prosecutions and incarceration to the extent consistent with public safety. And we do this through the timely information sharing and close coordination with law enforcement and community partners. I can't stress enough that everything else layers on top of this. The foundational partnerships you need to do intelligence-driven prosecution well are the core of the strategy and its implementation. So, by focusing intently on who and what most drives crime and diminishes public safety, prosecutors can then also limit the footprint that they have to bring to a community that is experiencing a public safety problem. If you know who is driving violent crime, by necessity, you're starting to identify who it is that is not, and you can start to differentiate between those groups of people, as we'll talk about. And this is done not through any complex algorithm. It's not necessarily heavily technology driven. It is the very human process of sharing information and intelligence between people who are informed about crime and public safety problems, and then moving that information into the hands of decision makers throughout the criminal justice system, either at the police department level, the prosecution level, and as we've evolved more, into probation departments, parole officers, and even community-based organizations. Making sure that people who make criminal justice decisions are armed with the maximum amount of information, intelligence, and context so that they can make the right decision on a case, on a defendant, or on an intervention. So the mindset has to move from a case processing mentality, whereby a prosecutor sees what arrests the police department has brought in and responds to them at a very high level, to a mindset where the goal is to make sure every case is closely examined and you know going in who the defendant is, what the case is about, and what all the context that surrounds that case is. That naturally is going to inform all of your prosecutions. It will drive prosecution strategy on what the priorities are, and the intelligence and information gained throughout the partnering and the intel gathering then can be used to support individual prosecutions. We know that defendant's associates are persons 1, 2, and 3. We know from the past that his rivalries exist in the following manner, and their techniques of storing guns follow the same trends. Those things get very granular as we learn them. There is, I think, a sense, and I think it's less and less now than it was before, that this is a very technology-driven process, that it is some form of one of the various monstrous machines from sci-fi movies that we've had over the years. And there is, I think, a very interesting conversation to have about risk scoring, predictive analytics, and the use of those tools in deploying resources and making prosecutorial decisions. But I want to emphasize that this conversation about intelligence-driven prosecution is not that conversation about risk scoring and predictive analytics. They exist independently. I think those offices that use predictive analytics and risk scoring do so within the same practice that implements IDP, but they are not necessarily coextensive ideas. There are all kinds of benefits you can get out of these tools. There are fears that it will replicate patterns that have existed in the past. And I think if one is going to use them, building it into a more human-driven, intelligence-driven framework is probably the right way to go about it. But to be clear, when we talk about intelligence-driven prosecution, we're not talking about in go for outputs, out comes a decision. So what are we talking about? As I said, it's a very human-driven process. The model we have in Manhattan is to put CSU, which is in charge of our intelligence-driven prosecution strategy, at the center of a number of different information flows, taking information in and then pumping it back out. So that is ingesting police intelligence. It is pushing back out the intelligence gained from the police, from social media resources, from various precincts, centralizing that, analyzing it, and then figuring out how best to disseminate it and get it into the hands of people who can make decisions in a timely fashion. And I'm going to try to get the microphone a little louder here. And that is what we mean. There are complexities that layer on top of this. There are information systems that live on top of this. But at its core, what we're trying to do is make sure that every person making decisions is armed with the maximum amount of information from all of the various partners across the system. So what we're doing is trying to inform the sound application of human judgment with all of the relevant facts and context. Now, as Mr. Vance talked about this morning, this began in Manhattan by layering a geographic system on top of our vertical prosecutions. We had not had attorneys who were assigned to specific parts of Manhattan. So by dividing our community into 5 separate CSU areas, our office was able to put a point of light in place, a team of an attorney and an analyst, to be in charge of becoming familiar with the crime trends, the public safety trends, and the community-based organizations and problems they identified in our various communities. And that was new for us. What it enabled was for each of these areas then to do a very deep and in-depth survey of crime trends in the smaller area. For example, Area 3 for us covers East Harlem. That's an area that has historically had a large number of gangs, a high level of gang violence. And when cases had come in from the 23rd and 25th precincts in East Harlem, we evaluated them as they came in with the knowledge of the arresting officer, the formal criminal record, and not the entirety of the context of the gang activity in the area. The move to an intelligence-driven model enabled by this geographic breakup allowed us to then know as an office what was going on locally, who was driving it, and what the significance of criminal events or non-significance of certain arrests was. And that was the change in mindset, again, before layering on any technology or any heavy resource investment. It was really going in, and this was under David when he started in the unit, understanding place by place what were the crime drivers in terms of trends, in terms of defendants, and knowing that before cases came in. So if we had somebody who was dramatically important to the life of the East Harlem community or the West Harlem or Washington Heights community come through our doors with a new case, we knew the importance of and the significance of that case to public safety. Okay. Now I talked about a shift from a case processing mentality to a mentality focused on the importance of the defendant and the case before us. And I use this big red blob to explain what cases look like, I think, in a traditional case processing model. We have the facts before us as relayed by whoever has made the arrest. We have the formal criminal record, and that is the view that a case processing DA's office is going to have of a criminal transaction. And that will inform how that criminal transaction is handled. But we know, right, that this is not true. We know that not all defendants, not all cases are created equal. We know that a vast majority of our violent crime, this is true in New York, I imagine it's true in many, if not all of your communities, a huge amount of our violent crime is driven by a very small number of repeat players who the police department is often aware of, and we need, as prosecutors being more intelligence driven, to learn to become more aware of before they come through our doors as well. So that process is really to carve out the slice of our defendant population and our corresponding case inventory that's really driving violent crime. That's an important development, and it's one that I think is worth pausing on because we've talked a little bit about friction with the police department. We've talked about foundational partnerships, and I think that that's a phrase you'll hear over and over again. I can't speak for David, but I do remember some of the rollout with the NYPD and trying to get into the weeds of forget who has open cases right now. Tell me who are the 10 most violent, most problematic offenders in your police precinct. Was not a conversation that I think the NYPD was used to having with a prosecutor's office before there was a case that they wanted to talk about. So that was certainly a change in mindset, was to say, we want to know as prosecutors, who's important to you as a police department? Why is it that they're important? What are their relationships? What are their rivalries, their alliances, the past things that we don't know about because they haven't necessarily been cases that we need to know about to evaluate what a public safety threat or non-threat the person is. Once that happens, and that happens over time, and I don't think it's an easy process by any sense, you are by definition also trying to identify those people who are not the main public safety threats. Mr. Vance spoke this morning about the massive reduction we've had in the number of misdemeanors that we've processed. And I think one of the reasons we've been able to do that confidently is because we're aware, at least to the degree that we can be aware, of who it is that we're prosecuting in a way that we weren't when he first took office. If someone who is a threat to go shoot someone or get shot themselves comes through our door, we can differ on policy. We can actually prosecute that case, whereas our policy might be to not do so. But we can also be very confident that when we've done our homework and studied the cases that we have, for example, with people who possess minor amounts of marijuana, when we look at those cases, they are not people who are driving our crime, and certainly not our violent crime. And we can then treat them accordingly with confidence. So the questions that you begin with there are, what are the crime problems in an area? Or we did. It may be subject matter rather than geography for some of your offices, but starting with either subject matter or geography, who are the defendants that are important to driving crime? We began with violent crime. Why do we believe that as a police department and prosecutor's office? If you have community organizations that you can bring to the table to help clarify that you are right, then do so. And then learn what we can about those folks. What are the Facebook names? What are phone numbers that have been used? Who have they had visit them in jail? These are the kind of stores of intel that can subsequently inform prosecutions, while at the same time looking to geographic violence hotspots can drive office priorities on a more macro level. So another thing that Mr. Vance brought up this morning was the impact that some of our proactive cases have had on gang violence and gun violence in Manhattan. The case that David spoke about that I worked on when I was in our Violent Criminal Enterprises unit involved 3 street gangs. One called Money Ave, was in this lower right portion. One called 3 Stacks, which was the blue in the middle. And one that had a number of names that we called MHB at the top. They had 50 plus shootings attributed to them over 2 or 3 years. And one of the things that we did through the intelligence-driven use of our crime strategies unit was to identify that this corridor in West Harlem was really experiencing levels and frequency of gun violence that was intolerable. So that was the macro, I think, use of our intelligence, was to say, we now need as an office to have a response to what's going on in this area. There's too much gun violence. What are we doing about it? Then on a more micro or more case level, when I worked on the case, I was able to hit the ground running because our crime strategies unit was able to feed me as a line prosecutor all the granular information I wanted. Who's been arrested with who in the past? What is the prior caseload? What do we know about their social media history? What phones have we dumped, et cetera, the kind of nuts and bolts, blocking and tackling level stuff that enabled us to bring a conspiracy case against these gangs. And the results did speak for themselves. We arrested 103 people in an area that contains housing developments that are 7,000, 8,000 people. When you add in the area with private housing, I think we're talking about a community of around 20 to 25,000 residents, and the arrests of just around 100 people virtually ended gun violence there in the year that followed And we saw persistent benefits for the year, I think 2 to 3 years that followed after that. I need to rerun this map. I think things have come back a little bit, but the point stands. And we've done this elsewhere. The polo grounds are historically very violent. The arrest of just under 20 folks there led to a dramatic de-escalation in gun violence. Further back, there was an issue in East Harlem that I alluded to before, and we saw much the same result, where the strategic arrest and strategic prosecution of a limited number of people can have dramatic and outsized impacts on gun violence and violent crime in a broader community. And I think that really does demonstrate the value of this model. It bears noting that these were not communities where the law enforcement response was 24/7 police boots on the ground, spotlights, mobile command posts. Some of those tools were used, but I think we all know when you use those tools, especially in the modern climate, that kind of heavy footprint can come at dramatic cost to engagement with the community, at dramatic cost to witness cooperation, and a more surgical and intelligence-led approach serves not to identify an area and then put a heavy boot on the area to tamp down violence, but to look at the area and say, who is really driving the issue here? If we go and prosecute those people and build proactive cases against those people, can we end this? When they come through, if we prosecute them aggressively, that limited slice of people, can we end this without a more heavy presence? And the answer for our office has been yes. So I think it's worth running through, and this may not be news to anyone anymore, but what the case processing workflow looks like. And it's how I think officers can operate at a very high level in taking in cases from the police department and ensuring that they're handled at the very highest level, but without really putting an intelligence-driven strategy behind it. You know, the police investigate traditionally, they make an arrest. The person who has made that arrest and maybe one or two of their team members communicate the facts to our attorney. And I think we should all remember that the person who makes an arrest, the person who grabs a very prominent gang member on the street with a loaded gun or chasing someone, may very well be, and is likely to be, someone who's not the most familiar with that defendant in the police department. There may be an expert in the gang unit, in the narcotics unit, who knows everything there is to know about the context around this person's activities and their current conduct, but it's not always likely to be the person with which we're speaking. We are informed by the formal criminal history, what the person's criminal justice involvement is, but not necessarily the context that has not led to convictions. So we're somewhat limited in evaluating the defendant's background in a case processing model. Our litigation, including search warrant practice, suppression practice, is also only informed by those things that are known to the case officer, and thus the line ADA, also informed by the criminal history. So we may not know what search warrants we want to write. We might not know who else might be relevant to interview. We might not know who is currently incarcerated, whose jail calls we could listen to. So I think the subsequent litigation and investigation of a case is limited when we are in a case processing mindset. Our disposition, similarly, will reflect what is appropriate, bounded by the four corners of what we know, but it will not incorporate those things that may be out there that we haven't gathered if we're in a case processing model. Significantly, when the case wraps up, all of the things that we've learned throughout the investigation and litigation of the case, and you all know there's no one who knows a defendant better than an assistant who is prepared to try that person, but the moment the trial either doesn't go or folds, all of that flies out the window and is relatively quickly forgotten, not through any fault of the individual assistant, but because they need to move on to the next thing. An intelligence-driven philosophy tries to break that gap in information and the loss of information. The goal is to begin with a storehouse of intelligence on important events and on people who drive crime. And that goes back to the foundational partnerships we've talked about, to speaking with the police agencies about who is important and why. It goes to preserving things after our cases close. You know, do you have a place that maintains intelligence we've mined during a case? And honestly, that's a very difficult thing for a crime strategies unit. Even 10 years in, we face challenges there. But the idea then is to use that storehouse to drive this process rather than react, to investigate collaboratively and say, what is it that we need to do about a crime problem in a given area? Who do we need to investigate? As we did in West Harlem when we noticed a spike in gun violence there over a number of years. It means that our office is in touch with the right people in the police department, or your office would be in touch with the right investigators, not just the person who grabbed a priority defendant on the street that day. And that we bring to bear all of the context that the most knowledgeable police investigators have about a crime-driving person or trend or event. Only at that point do we then proceed to a case. And that case is driven by the storehouse of intelligence that we've spent time building. Before we knew there was going to be an arrest, when what we knew was this is a priority defendant, priority trend. Step back. The litigation is informed by that as well. There are some suppression impacts. There are certainly search warrant and investigative impacts to knowing who a person is, what their real history has been, and who their associates are. We have written search warrants that we never would have if we didn't know more about a person when they came through our doors. Very famously, Al Capone was finally incarcerated on tax evasion. That's a strategy that's effective on our highest priority offenders. But in order to do that, you need to know who Al Capone is before he's evading his taxes. So I think our dispositions have been in a targeted fashion, driven by knowing who really is driving violent crime in our communities. And that leads to the desire and effort to maintain information rather than allow it to sit in closed cases and leave when attorneys are finished, making this an iterative process. And that really is the goal. I mean, when we start with the foundational partnerships and crime survey with the police department, the goal is to get to a place where we can be confident that we know when we prosecute someone that we are doing so knowing all the context that goes with that person. On a more mundane level, these building blocks are what your crime strategies unit or what the entity involved in doing intelligence-driven prosecution is going to work to obtain. And this, in a smaller office could simply be one or two people who are involved with a specific geography, a currently ongoing gang or narcotics feud. It does not need to be throughout your entire jurisdiction to start. If you have a priority in geography or subject matter, you can start by learning what are the important events that have occurred. There were a number of cases that we had in the West Harlem investigation where there were 10-person on 10-person brawls. What that looked like in the prosecutor's office when we were processing cases was a disorderly conduct arrest or two. Right, a 10-person on 10-person brawl that the police effectively break up does not seem like a huge case by the time it reaches us. In the life of a community, though, when 10 16-year-olds are beating 10 other 18-year-olds outside of a school with pipes and bats, that was a big event, and it's not appropriately reflected in the case that we had. So we would gather intel on those events. Who was seen leaving the scene of a shooting? They're not criminally responsible, but we certainly need to know who the people
5-minute warning
in and around gun violence are. Intelligence on defendants, such as their associates, their nicknames, the dates on which they've been involved in conduct, informed all of this. Crime trends. We're currently in a rash right now where the guns in Harlem are being hidden in fanny packs. There was a while it was slop sinks in public housing, and things on a granular level like that help inform prosecutions. Those can lead to more macro level data, mapping out where shootings have occurred, where gun recoveries have occurred, and then prior cases and prior conduct. The goal is to keep that in some repository, and that can be a formal data system. That can be as simple as the Microsoft Office suite. And I'd like to get there for a second. Skipping through this for a second. These are all products that can be created through a CSU, but I want to get to what we can do here. And I'd like to end on this note because I think it's important that intelligence-driven prosecution is enabled by a lot of technology. It is not dependent on it. We have built some products that live on top of Microsoft Excel and on top of Microsoft Word. But at heart, if you want to keep track of what's going on in a community, you speak to the police precinct, they tell you the date, they tell you the people involved or the nicknames, And that can go right into a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that is sortable and searchable. Having a great analyst who's good with Excel helps here, but you can keep a timeline of violence in Microsoft Word. You can keep a pretty robust spreadsheet of intelligence in Microsoft Excel without any significant further investment in technology. The one thing I would advise, and actually this is a good place to stop here, the timelines we have been very helpful. Putting together a timeline of violence lets an assistant DA understand how to place the event that he or she is prosecuting in the context of what has gone on before and after that event. It also enables very effective witness interviews because you can sit down with either a prospective defendant or a witness who is somewhat in the gang life or the violent life and know the world they're living in. Know when they say my friend got shot right after Christmas, you can go through your timeline and say, oh, was it before New Year's? Yes, here's the one. And be able to pull up those things in real time. The only technology that I would really advise moving along to is the arrest alert system. You know, I close with this. One of the things that operationalizes intelligence-driven prosecution is knowing who has come in and when in terms of a new case. It's great to build storehouses of intelligence on what's going on in a neighborhood, who's involved, and what we know about those people. But if they come through your doors with a new case, get prosecuted, the case is closed, and then and only then, through a very cumbersome process, do you learn that you had gotten a priority defendant through your doors on a case. That's not helpful. So there are arrest alert systems offered by some vendors. You can build it yourself as well. The technology is not terribly complicated, that enable you to know when someone's been fingerprinted, link that person with the knowledge that your crime strategies unit or your office keeps on the person, and then deliver that to the prosecutors in real time. And I'd be happy to talk offline about how to implement an arrest alert system. Depending on what you have available, much of it depends on the information flow between the police department, the local sheriff, the local jail, and your offices. It can be unique across jurisdictions, but that is something that I would highly advise building into an intelligence-driven model. I think I got about a 2-minute warning here.
1 minute.
1 minute. So I think I'll wrap up with, one of the things that we're moving into now is knowing this has also enabled things beyond our prosecutions. When you're looking at communities and saying this area has a great level of gun violence or an intolerable level of gun violence, you can begin with that will inform our prosecutions here. You can move on to that will inform how we interact with the police there. But it goes beyond that. And I think once you've identified people in those areas who have been shot at repeatedly, have shot at people again and again, before there are cases, if those are young people, that information can also drive other interventions. A call to a violence interrupter saying John Smith was seen running from another shooting last night. Before we have to deal with him, can you try to reach out to that person? And the shift in mentality to knowing who's important before there's a case opens up a larger world of interventions beyond just prosecution.